The game is Liberia, Descent into Hell. This is a Counter-Strike mini-game, and as you can see, the board's quite small. There aren't a lot of counters, about as much as you'd see in a later SPI magazine S&T game. I think it's 288. A decent number, but with this tiny map, it seems like a very, very small game. On the other hand, there's a lot of play aids here. A chart, okay, you could probably keep track of this on paper. Another chart for the peace talks, which is sort of a timeline for the game. When certain events happen, there were a number of different peace initiatives, which most of the groups in Liberia, rebels and government groups, and there are several factions. At the beginning of the game, there's only two. The government itself, which is the purple faction controlling everything, and the NPFL, which is Charles Taylor's group, which is the main rebel group throughout the game. But as you can see, there are a number of other colors, some government controlled, some less government, well, rebel controlled, and then kind of this odd one for Prince Johnson and his little faction. You also have, obviously, control markers, which is most of what you see on the map. If you look closely, you'll see there's some stacks of units, but most of them are single counters, which indicate the control marker alone. These guys have 3 numbers on them, and leaders have the same values as the troops that they're under them. Yes, those are children. The first number is an offensive firepower, the second is a defensive firepower, and the third, and essentially offensive and defensive ratings, and the third number is, I think, called fortitude. It's essentially how many hits a unit can take in casualties. Okay, so what do we have otherwise? We have some markers for Gondar, which are basically areas that are so pillaged that the residents have fled into the wilderness to try to survive. We also have vandalized, which are for Monrovia, which is this little insert of the map covering this space here. The capital city has a number of different sectors in it, and they're treated the same as other sectors in terms of movement for the most part. With these Zoe counters, which represent witch doctors, priests, and the like, hostages, local hostages taken who are too valuable to kill, so they reduce an attack against a group that has them. We also have little things like transvestites. If you have that counter, you can spend it to use these men and women's clothing to attack better. Radio station, I have no idea what it is. The Ignu Black Berets, there's a possibility of, well, a likelihood, I think, of this interim government being formed, which is notoriously ineffectual. Alright, what else do you have? Here you have all kinds of different tribal peoples or ethnic groups that are present in Liberia or perhaps abroad, and they're divided into 3 kinds of units. You have normal men, you have kids, and those kids are improperly labeled. They are actually veterans. And you have veterans. And again, they have the same ratings, the attack, defense, and number of hits, essentially. And what you'll notice, which is kind of interesting, is that the children are better at attacking than the men because of fanaticism or whatever. You also have the Ecomog, which is a Nigerian-led confederation that intervened in the Civil War. I think they intervened on both sides, actually. And you have pools of leaders that you can select from for your various factions. They can become disgraced, as you can see, if they lose battles or somehow otherwise end up off the board. You have this set of donors, mainly foreign countries, but there are also drugs and prostitutes, and of course Scandinavians, who can add both monetary and something called juju to your faction. And eventually they could actually intervene with forces as well in some of these cases. The markers track here, right now all I'm keeping track of on it, there may be other things, is an amount of money that each faction has, and the government has more money than the rebels, and an amount of juju, and the rebels have more juju. Now juju is a bunch of things, but it basically represents the standing politically of the group, as well though with certain mystic abilities, etc., and that's what the term actually refers to. You have your turn record chart. You have a random events table. Each player is going to be rolling random events during the turns. We'll get to that in a moment. And we have this reference here as well, which has a checkpoint table. Checkpoints come into play after a certain peace talk comes in, just to indicate the timeline issue. And a list of all the things supposedly that affect juju. I haven't checked to see if everything actually is on here. We got a sequence of play, and you can see you get a lot of, you know, little play aids here. So it's not just this tiny little map area control game. There's a lot of special rules and influence in it. And you actually get a fairly thick little rule book. It's what, 30-something pages? No, 40-something pages, including notes on this kind of unstudied war. And particularly gruesome war when it comes down to it. I mean, with children fighting, with the drug trade going on, the blood diamonds, and all this, it's not going to be a pretty war. Okay, well, let's take a look. And speaking of the rule book, it's not terribly well organized. There's an attempt to reference things in it. Sometimes they get the numbers wrong. It's also not written in such a way that it serves as a good reference for me. It's got case numbers, which I usually like, but when the references don't line up with them correctly, it's not terribly helpful. It's not all that bad. It's better than just being all prose, but it's also worded in ways, sometimes it feels a little like it's ambiguous. Sometimes there's actual contradictions in it, and it's hard to tell what you're supposed to, you know, how much you're supposed to get out of it, but it's not too bad. I've certainly seen worse, and it shouldn't be hard to kind of fake it. Okay, what about the sequence of play? Well, hey, what are you trying to do to win, actually? Well, let's look at the victory conditions here. And there's a couple of different ways to win. First of all, one player could just give up, obviously. And that's actually covered in the rules as opposed to otherwise. But otherwise, if a player's juju goes down to 0, they've lost the game. So it's important to not spend all your juju and not lose it through the juju level adjustments. If that doesn't happen, if no one wins an automatic victory, we play through until we get to this Abuja 2 peace treaty, which actually works. There's elections, and you check to see who won. Well, how do you check? It's a sum of political power and money and votes you have, etc. So this is done. You get votes for each county you have, and the counties are distinguished by these color patterns. You'll see, for example, Sino County is this kind of pink color, and you can kind of tell most of them. Sometimes you kind of say, oh, is that all one county? Yeah, it is. Monrovia is part of Montserrado County. There's a 1 space county. There's also these 3 outside the country areas, and you'll see that the entire rebellion starts out in the Ivory Coast. All right. So you get votes for counties, and that's the biggest, 25,000 for controlling a county. You also get 25,000 for each of the boxes within Monrovia itself, and 750 votes for each juju and each dollar that you have on your track. And you add them up and see who wins. And then you roll 2d6 and see how long you stay in power before the next insurgency happens. And historically, Charles Taylor won and then was overthrown in 2003. Okay. The setup. The government player is allowed to set up anywhere within Liberia, and the rebel has to set up in Ivory Coast. You'll see that I've set up with an attempt to defend areas where the rebellion isn't, because the rebel's going to get a chance to build troops out there. And I've also set up the special leaders, who are your main leaders for a faction. They double the win-loss ratio on Juju if you win or lose battles. And we have President Doe and Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor has given himself 3 leaders. The maximum stacking limit here is 5 regular combat counters, 3 leaders, and your supreme commander for that faction. Factions can't stack with one another, even if they're allied. Okay, and they can't transfer troops to each other, etc. Let's look at what the sequence of play is like. So the first thing is the rebel player gets a random events phase, and he's going to roll 2 dice on this random events table, 11 to 66. And speaking of the dice, see if I've got them kicking around here somewhere. Ah, yeah, here they are. Very interesting dice that Counter-Strike puts with their game. Kind of exciting. Unfortunately, this is a game where you need probably more than 2 dice. And we'll get into that in a moment, because the combat system for this is very, very odd. I'm not sure how much I'm really going to like it, but it's definitely an innovative system that I've never seen before. Then we go to the peacekeeping phase, and we basically roll randomly to see if the peace talks expand, if ECOMOG replaces their force commander. That's the other African countries involved here. You try to see who has the initiative for that turn, and I am damned if I remember how you determined that. Whoever has the highest juju with a die roll to determine. Then you create hostages and zoes. Now these are optional rules. They both work in kind of a similar way in terms of how you get them. For zoes, what you do is, well, hostages happen first. Let's talk about them first. For hostages, you bid money. And whoever bids the most money can buy that many hostages at that price. And then the other player has the right to buy hostages at that price as well, if there are any left. Zoes work the same way, except you bid juju. The ECOMOG cannot have, I think, either of them, if I recall correctly. They also can't use drugs for combat, which is another little weirdness. And that's something you're allowed to buy in combat. Another optional rule. Okay. So you buy these then. We'll touch the optional rules maybe for how they operate in combat a little later. But let's get to the meat of the game. Well, before we hit that, we've got a couple more phases. The political phase, the Gondor status, the amount of damage done to the provinces. Not in Monrovia itself. That's harder to fix. Sort of steadily improves. So if I've done a lot of damage to an area, on one turn it flips over the Gondor marker, and on the next turn it's removed. Influence donors. Now this is an interesting little piece where you're allowed to basically bid to try to get these markers to move. Now on the track, and you'll see there's different tracks, they're all calibrated a little differently, but it swings from pro-rebel all the way to rebel influence, through rebel support, neutral, government support, and influence intervention for the government. Some of them don't go all the way. So for example, this only goes to support of the government. It will not go to intervention. The French didn't like the government. Anyway, how does this mechanic work? Well, what you're allowed to do is each player can spend juju, and he has to spend up to twice, well, he has to spend twice the juju support value for that government or entity. So for example, to get the drug trade, you'd have to spend only 2 juju to try to improve that, whereas to get France's support, you'd have to spend 12 to try to improve the value there. So you pay that as a base value, and then you roll a number of dice of your choice. you have to pay that second value in juju equal to the total number of pips that you rolled on those dice. For every 4, 5, or 6 you roll, you move the donor marker 1 box in your favor. And for each 1 you roll, you move the donor box 1 box in your opponent's favor. And you can kind of roll against each other to move this. The exception here is, or the caveat here, is that the total movement of the marker, of any given marker, can't go more than 2 boxes in either direction in any one phase. Now, there's an optional rule, which I'm going to be playing with on this, which has to do with, I hope I'm going to remember to play it. It has to do with if you ignore certain certain powers. And I'm trying to look at this. I don't see it offhand. And oh, there it is. Discount donors. Okay, so as people are paying, if neither player makes an attempt on a given power in a turn, you mark something down, and that power now has that many additional dice that are free if they get triggered. So, for the price that you'd pay to move that counter, normally, the double the juju cost, plus however many additional dice you want to buy, you also get free dice equal to however many turns nobody bid on that country in a row. That makes countries easier, or powers in the case of drugs or prostitutes, easier to influence than they would normally be. Cheaper in a sense. You still have to put a base price in there, but you might get a fistful of dice for paying attention to them finally. And that can cause things to move a little bit more quickly. Okay, then after all of these attempts have been made, and there don't have to be any, and some of them can just be ignored as we noticed, then each power who has support of one of these groups, and at the beginning you'll see the rebels have a pile of supporters, and the government have a pile of supporters. Countries more aligned with them. Each one that has support gives you its values, which are a juju value. Remember, you pay double that in order to make your attempt, a minimum, and it has a dollar value. So you'd be adding dollars and juju from these foreign supporters. All right. Now we go to the economics phase, and you get cash for areas that you own. In order to get cash from the domestic value, you have to deal with the economic sites, which have little factory markers in it. There's a lot of markers and a lot of little indicators in this game, a lot of stuff on the map that you have to pay attention to. In addition, Monrovia has factories, but they're kind of special ones that are a little different. The ones outside Monrovia have a production value of 8. You decide how many dice you want to roll, and this is what the game is like. I mean, all the decisions, all the actions, you get to decide how many dice you want to roll. You decide how many dice you want to roll, and if you get less than or equal to the production value, 8 in this case, you get that much money. So probably you want to roll 1 or 2 dice, depending on how much you want to risk, but you may want to roll 3 to up your chances. Of course, that's pretty likely to fail. If you roll over the amount, well, then here's what happens. You've exploited the site out of control and looted it. You get $12, but a Gondor marker goes down. And the site doesn't produce money until the Gondor marker is removed. So there may be times when you just want to roll an infinite number of dice and pillage the territory. Monrovia works the same, except when you roll higher than an 8, you vandalize the province. Same effect, except a vandalism marker goes into play, and those aren't removed except by random event. Now, the money that you got has to be paid in maintenance. Each leader you have on the map costs you 1 juju for scandals and $1 for corruption. Ecomog war parties also cost you a juju and $1. And that's just for a single stack of Ecomog units. You don't have to pay for them if they're in the Nigeria box, though. And if Ecomog is neutral, neither side has to pay for them. All right. Now, after you do this, you can start buying leaders and additional soldiers. To buy leaders, you have to pay $5 and 3 juju. And this comes off immediately, and you can place the leader in a legal location. You can stack it. Whoa. I may have cheated. Maybe everything's not supposed to go in your available leaders box. Nope, everything goes in the available leaders box. Cool. At the beginning. We'll see. There may be things that remove leaders from there into the force pool, but when you buy a leader, you're allowed to put him either into your available leaders box or on the board. And I'm not sure how you're going to get leaders in your force pool. Obviously, there are some factions that don't start on the board, and maybe you have to buy those leaders, or maybe leaders get removed and put back into your force pool. Okay. Now, let's see what else we have. Like I said, Ecomog ends up costing you $1 and a juju. U.S. Marines do not. They're free. Okay. So let's go back. Yeah. So if you want to place a leader on the board and not on the available leaders box, you place it on a district which you control. It can also be placed abroad, except for the AFL, the government, which can only... The government itself, this purple faction, rather than some of their aligned factions, you can't place them abroad because, well, they're not allowed to leave Liberia. Controlled districts are districts containing units of your faction, or if there are no units of either player, there are the districts in a county that you control. And you'll notice there are control markers on most of the counties, well, on all of the counties to begin with by the government. Dead leaders. If somebody's been eaten, they can't be brought back to the game, or buried for that matter. Even witch doctors fail to help you with that. Okay, buying fighters. Now, you're allowed to buy your troops. Buying troops is a little more complicated than you might think in some games. If you notice, each band has a racial or tribal well, not racial, but a cultural or tribal association. So, for example, these are the Sapo. These here are the Mandingo. And they can only be built in certain areas. It costs a base cost for different groups. It costs $1 for kids, $4 for men, $10 for new veterans. New veterans. And you can only place them where their symbol is, and you can only build them with factions they're aligned with. Okay? And so, for example, if you look on the map, let's take a look at the mana. Well, they're not a great choice. Let's take a look for the check mark. Let's say I own that. Well, I can build this, the Grebo, in this sort of area here. I can't build them outside of there, except in the off-map areas, Sierra Leone, Republic of Guinea, and Ivory Coast, because there's lots of refugees. Every group is available there, except, I believe, oh no, America Liberians are available there as well. Some are only allowed off-map, the Gambians and the Burkinabe. They are unavailable within Liberia itself. They're foreign mercenaries, essentially. Okay, and when you buy them, you deploy them in with a leader. It can either be a current warband or stack, as you like, or it can be just in an area that you're allowed to build them, but you have to bring a new leader on for them from your available leaders box. All right. I'm going to take a pause here and come back because we've got a lot of rules left to go. Okay, so that's pretty much the economic phase, and now we get into the combat, the movement in combat itself. Now, movement in combat is actually very, very simple here. Compared to all the kind of chromy factors that really make up most of the rules here. Movement in combat, but it's still, there's something kind of odd about it, because again, you get to pick how many dice you roll for anything. Movement in combat, the way it works in basis is you can move as far as you like. There are a couple of terrain factors that can affect this though. So, if you enter an enemy area, you have to stop and fight them, and you can't keep moving after that. Your pieces flip over, they can't be used again. Flip over may or may not mean, you know, you could just flip the piece over, but you can see it's just a blank counter that way. They suggest kind of turning the counter upside down. I don't know what I'm going to do and what's going to work best. It's going to be a tough call, actually. Okay. So let's look at, there are some factors though. When you move across a jungle, and that's these little dotted green things here, you can see, if you look real close. When you move across a jungle, you have to stop and flip. You may have to fight too. And when there's a mountain, you can't, and that's kind of harder to see here, but you can see these little mountain triangles here. You can't move at all. And the map is very busy and cluttered, and it's kind of difficult to see what's going on there. You can't cross the mountains, though. There's special rules to handle Mount GB, which is here, where you can possibly pass through. And we'll take care of that. That's actually an optional rule. You can drop units off as you go, and they're flipped over. If you end up splitting forces, you have to leave a leader with every force, so you may have to pull leaders out of your available leaders box. Those are already paid for or whatever, so that's not a big deal. It's just they have to show up if you don't have someone to split off for it. You can go through friendly units, but you can't, including other factions, but you can't go through enemy units without stopping and fighting. At some point or another, there's checkpoints, which are going to require rolling on this checkpoint table every time you leave a county. Remember, those are the big colored areas. Or if you enter or leave the country. Those aren't in play at the beginning of the game, but as things deteriorate, it becomes harder and harder to move between places. Okay, let's say you're in a situation where you're in combat, where you've moved in where there's an enemy or stack or stacks. In that case, the defender can attempt to retreat before combat. In order to do so, they have to roll less than or equal to one of the numbers on one of their counters. Basically, you pick the highest number on on any one of your counters, and that allows you to determine how well you can disengage from combat. But if you do, you still have to pay a juju effect for retreating. And if you have multiple stacks in the area, each stack has to retreat, and each one costs an additional juju penalty. All right. If you go to combat, then you choose how many dice you want to roll. The attacker uses his attack values, the defender from one war party. The defender uses his defense values from one war party. You add them together, you roll a number of dice of your choosing. And if you roll equal to or less than your total combat factor, you cause hits. Let's see how many hits. You cause hits equal to the amount that you rolled, the total sum of the dice pips. However, there are some things that can make some dice count towards the equal to or over, and if you roll over, you cause no hits. There are some things that can make dice count towards the equal to or over, i.e. you could end up exceeding, but they don't no longer count towards hits. For example, if you're attacking into forest or mountain, you ignore all 5s and 6s you roll towards actual damage only. Which means if you roll a lot of 5s and 6s, you might exceed your target number that you're aiming for. But even if you end up lower than it, those 5s and 6s don't count. There's some other factors that work the same way. If you're unable to have supply, 3s and 4s work that way. If there are hostages, 2s and 3s work that way. So you can see there's kind of this interplay of different effects that can take place. Destroyed fighters go back on the recruitment chart. Destroyed leaders roll a die. On a 1 through 4, they go in the disgraced leader box, and they can show up again. On a 5 or a 6, however, they've been killed, and the person who killed them has the option to either bury them, in which case they get a D6 money from their grateful family, or to eat them, in which case they get an amount of juju equal to that person's offensive and defensive values. Either way, if they're dead, they stay dead. Whoever scores the more hits has won the battle, and the other side just lost the battle and has to retreat, and they have to retreat all their stacks, and they take the juju penalties as they would with retreat before combat. If you retreat, you have to flip. Some special rules here. Ecomog can retreat by sea from port to port, and ports are the airports or the factories along the sea, I believe. But only the Ecomog can do that. When retreating, you ignore the checkpoint roll. We already talked about that. Okay, now the government player rolls 2 dice for random events. And in the case of the 2 random events things, there may be a discussion of the active player on the random events table. If that's the case, it's the person whose random events phase it is. Is just a way to make each person have kind of an equal chance, I guess, of things. Now we come to the end of the turn phase, and there's the unflipment step. What a beautiful sounding word. All the counters, all the combat counters that have been flipped are unflipped so that they can operate again next turn. You make a die roll to see if disgraced leaders come back, and that's just like on a 1 or 2 or something. If they're disgraced, they move back into the available pile. I don't remember the exact number there. Then you determine who controls different boxes. And, well, who controls different counties, and who controls the Monrovia boxes. The Monrovia boxes, those can change control if you're sitting in it and it's the other person's. Counties, it goes to the person who owns the most territories in that way. Well, no, it doesn't. I'm sorry, I lied. You count how many districts in the county you have, you double that number, and you roll a d6. If either player succeeds, then, but only one player, then they get control of the whole county. Otherwise, the county is considered to be uncontrolled. If you control the county and there's no troops there, or you who are the only one with troops, you maintain control of it. Okay. What if only one person has troops in a county, he gets control of it, even if the other player controlled it. So it doesn't matter how much you have. If you have the only military presence, you get it. Okay. And there's a juju gain loss for counties changing hand, or for Monrovia boxes changing hand. All Zoes and hostages come off the map at this point, so you have to buy them again each turn. I haven't really explained how they work. I'll touch on them in a moment. Let's see if there's anything else. And then we go to the next turn. And we just complete the cycle. The base leader, I've already kind of explained. A lot of the different factions, they're triggered by events or by sort of events. The peace talks can trigger them. And I'm not worried too much about how they happen whenever they do happen. Ecomog comes into play for whoever has the Nigerian support or intervention, and they can start bringing forces in either of those cases. Let's see, we've got the U.S. has special rules too for their Marines. Okay. I don't see them right away. All right, how do you get supply? You get supply from a friendly controlled Monrovia area or an economic site that doesn't have a Gondor counter, or a port, which is Robertsville and Maryland County with the airports in them. And Ecomog's able to move special between airports and factory areas. They can do kind of airlift, perhaps. They have a special movement which happened back here in the peacekeeping phase. All right. In order to be in supply, you have to trace a line of friendly controlled land areas back to a supply source. And if you can do so, and you can't go through mountain borders or Mount GB unless you have already conquered Mount GB, as it were. If you can't trace, you're out of supply. And like I said, when you fight, 3s and 4s are ignored except for exceeding your target number. I already went over victory conditions. The setup I kind of went over. The optional rules. What do Zoes do for you? You can buy them, and then you can stack them with any of your units. Well, except Ecomog or Ulimo K. Ulimo K is a radical Muslim fundamentalist group which was trying to exterminate the pagans. What they're able to do is after a combat, if your war party has more Zoes, you can modify your own die roll by rolling an additional die and either adding it or subtracting it. You have to declare which option you're doing before you make the die roll. Now, pretty clearly, you would be subtracting only if you had already gone over. You might not want to do either if you're already at a high number there, near your limit. So that's kind of a powerful advantage. That goes to whichever player has the most Zoes in a combat. If a Zoe is in a war party that loses or retreats, the Zoe that are there go away and they go back to the force pool. Hostages, remember, you purchase them in a similar sort of way except with money, and you build those under your own supplied war parties. What they do is they add that war party's defensive firepower. They add 2 to it. And they also add 2 to the last number, the fortitude, how many hits a unit can take. When a unit is destroyed, the hostage also goes back. And there's a penalty similar to terrain with hostages. 2s and 3s become non-counting numbers, except for exceeding your target number. You can't have hostages with Ecomog, and you can't even create hostages if there are U.S. Marines present. Okay, the IGNU. This is the Interim Government. One of these many special little rules that's optional in this case. And we'll kind of worry about it when we get to it. It's not really detailed rules, but that, the INPFL, which is Prince Johnson's group, which kind of breaks off of the NPFL, replaces a couple of their leaders, and then becomes a government faction, actually. The U.S. Marines show up at a certain point in the treaty order, and they have a pro-government influence in the game for a while. I believe they get removed eventually. Maybe only if the government orders them out. There's bribery and seduction optional roles. You're allowed to pay $10 per pip on a die, And if you roll within your target range, and at $60 you get a guaranteed success, the other player, the defending player, because it's during your pulse, has to retreat from the hex from the area he's in. On a roll of a 6, if that succeeds on a $60 payoff, the force is actually destroyed, and one of the defending leaders is killed. Drugs. When you're fighting in a combat, you can secretly choose to expend money. For each dollar expended, you add 1 to your total firepower. But you can't exceed the number of units that you have in a war party. And again, Ekamog can't use this. There's the library, which I've placed on the board. It's not really supposed to be there, but I want it there to remind me. If you've got a war party in that space, you can sack the library. When you do so, you lose some juju immediately, right? I don't remember. Well, you lose some juju. I don't remember how much. But then, oh yeah, you lose 1d6 juju. And if you use it in combat, you roll a die. On a 5 or a 6, you destroy... oh, I'm sorry. Its effect in combat is essentially the same as a Zo counter, because books are mystical, of course. However, books are also good for making cigarettes out of. So anyway, when you use it in combat, on a 5 or a 6, it's destroyed and removed from the game. If the war party that uses the library is destroyed, you roll, and on a 1 through 4, the library is captured. On a 5 or a 6, it's destroyed. There's the statue of the unknown soldier, which is over here on the Capitol Hill, and this was President Doe's creation, supposedly with a blood sacrifice. It has a lot of juju. Its special ability, the controlling player can use it to snipe at any attacking units if there's going to be a fight in there. And any enemy war party that enters the Capitol Hill has to roll a die, actually even if there isn't going to be a fight. And that war party takes that many hits. That's for the whole war party. And then after the battle, on a 1 through 3, the statue's been destroyed. Otherwise, it survives regardless of who wins the battle. Mount Jeepy, which is here, normally would be impassable, but with this optional rule, you can attempt to enter it. You can't stop in it, but you can walk through it. You roll a die, and that's how many units, how many fighters you lose out of your stack. Zos and leaders aren't affected, unless of course you wipe out the entire stack. However, for each Zo that you have in your war party, you subtract 2 from the die roll. If you get through without any losses whatsoever, you get a die 6 of juju. And it's not clear when you can draw supply through it. I know it's supposedly you can draw supply based on this rule. That's not explained in here. Transvestites, it doesn't explain how you get them, but if you have the counter for them, you can use them in combat, and they function like a Zo, but instead of disappearing, when you commit it to a battle, you have to hand it over to the opposing player. The Butt Naked Brigade, another special rule. There's one leader who has an elite Butt Naked Brigade. They would strip before combat, and when you use them, you can employ their leader like a Zo, except it works kind of the opposite. You can add or subtract to the other player's, you can add or subtract a die to the other player's hit total, which could cause an overroll, making no losses, or you could subtract from it and making them do less to you. We're playing with the diplomatic discount donors, which, remember, if somebody's ignored for a long time, they get extra dice to bonus the swing that happens from them. Abandoned fighters. And I'm playing with all the optionals because, of course, this is my first time playing and I want to get the full experience. As much confusion as possible. You're allowed to leave fighters without a leader behind. If you do this, They can be the only remaining units in the district, and now the district is controlled by these neutral fighters. And anybody who wants to take it has to march in and attack it. It's not controlled by either player for purposes of control determination, which to me means they won't spoil someone else's control if you leave them behind, unless you have units there as well. And finally, battlefield promotions, which is if you win a battle, any one unit can be raised to the next level. Children to men, men to veterans, I would suppose. That's it. I'm very intrigued by a number of things. First of all, I like a lot of chrome in a game, and this looks like it's filled with chrome. The actual system looks very, very simplistic. I mean, there's barely rules for movement, as it were. This is almost not a war game because of how little it's simulating those, but I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt, if you wish, or allow, consider it as such, in the same way that I consider games like A House Divided to be war games. I think as a war game, it's on the very light level. It's not really simulating a lot about the military, but then again, it's not really simulating too much else either. It's almost like it's an event-driven game with all this chrome, all these special rules tagged on to a very, very simple moving and fighting system, at least in terms of how much the rules are. What else is there other than combat, though? It's a civil war, there's these political options, etc. But it's not like, there's a serious economic system at play here, or a lot of diplomacy at play, or anything like that. So I think wargame is the only real category it fits into. Also has that intriguing die rolling convention where most actions you get to choose how many dice you roll, and you just are aiming to get below a target number but as high as you can below, which I think is kind of interesting. It allows you to take more risks by adding dice. I'm not sure how much I'm going to see of that. I tend to play kind of cautiously, but I could see someone who's in a losing position taking a risky position. The thing that worries me is there's some sorts of bidding, especially with the optional rules with the Zoes and the hostages. That's going to be a little harder to implement, but I'm used to doing that in the Euro games, so I think I'll be able to handle that pretty easily here. You may want to trim optional rules out if you're playing solitaire, but I think the bidding will actually make the game more interesting in a two-player game. All right, well, I guess we're ready to roll, and let's see just how disgusting we can make this. All right, up it goes.